Hey everyone, Matt Thomas. Thanks for watching. So this lesson right here, to me, is the most important of all the lessons because it establishes your philosophy, your belief, your feeling towards poetry, and your students like right away are going to walk out of the classroom knowing more about poetry than they ever have based on this lesson. So I can't over exaggerate. I don't know if that's the right word. I can't emphasize enough how important this lesson is when establishing that you're going to teach poetry different than any other teacher that has taught them before. I hope I said that right. Your students will walk out going, wow, this is actually going to be cool because of this. Anyway, it's a one-day lesson, and there are some things you'll want to do to set up this lesson. So anyway, I'm going to explain like how I do the lessons here. So here it is. So the first thing, when the students walk in, first of all, this is the Simile Lyrical Stanza lesson. So it's essentially teaching similes, but it is so much more than that. Like I said, it establishes a foundation of how you're going to teach poetry or how your students will learn it. Your students will get excited about poetry based on this lesson alone. So the first thing, what happens is, and you'll see I have all these links. Anytime there's something underlined, it's a link. So what I do is when the students come in, I have them write down the definitions of poetry. So the way my class is set up is I always have on the overhead projector what I like have. They pull a piece of paper out and what I want them to title the paper. So when the bell rings, I just start talking. I don't say, hey guys, pull out a piece of paper. They would have already done it. It's very routine in my class. So they walk in, they pull a piece of paper out, they title it poetry. Once the bell rings, I start talking and I go, okay guys, write this down. And so here's the definitions of a poem. Now this first one, so I have the students write these down. This first one is so important because it's the one you're going to be referencing, going back to, as you're teaching poetry. So I have them write down poem. Now people think they know what a poem is, but as I said in the intro video, essentially in education, the textbooks generally just focus on one small aspect of poetry. And so even as teachers, respectfully, I think throughout the years, teachers themselves have been teaching one small aspect of poetry for so long that sometimes we forget that that's just one little sliver of poetry, right? If poetry was a pie and there were all these different aspects of it, the stuff taught in textbooks would be like 5% of it. It's that small compared to what else is out there. And so this is hopefully throughout these lessons, you'll see what I'm talking about. So a poem, and I tell them this, a poem is a verbal composition characterized by the use of condensed language chosen for its sound and suggestive power. Now that is such an important definition. I'll go back to that. Then I have the students write down metaphor, personification, imagery, stanza, and purpose. Purpose is also very, very important when it comes to analyzing poetry. So I haven't really established what we're doing with the poetry yet. The students just write this down. So right away, they're like, oh, poetry, right? Okay, so that's step one. Step two is then I ask the students how many of them are not fans of poetry. So I say, okay, guys, we wrote down the notes that we need for poetry. Let me just ask you, and please be honest with me, how many of you guys aren't fans of poetry? And then the hands go up. I mean, like, no joke. Almost all the students' hands will go up. If you have a good relationship with your students, they'll be honest with you. And then you say, okay, I totally understand why you guys would say that. And I would say, here's the thing. I would say, I'm going to tell you, not only do you not hate poetry, you guys absolutely love it. You just don't know it yet. And I said, now I have to support what I say. I got to back up what I say. And so that's when I go into the music lyrics exercise. So let me open this thing up. This is what you will have to set up in advance. So I already did steps 1 and 2. If you're looking at the screen, you know that. So I asked a student who's not a fan of poetry. Most of the hands go up. Then I tell them that they actually love poetry and I have to prove it. So what I do then is I say, okay, guys, so I have a stack of poems in my hand. And I say, I'm gonna start reading some lines from a popular poem. And you tell me if, who the author is. Just shout it out. No need to raise your hand, just shout it out. And I'll start with one fish, blue fish, and I forgot the poem. That one. And they're like, Dr. Seuss. And I'm like, yeah, you're right. And I'll be like, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Shakespeare, perfect. And then I'll say, once upon a time, a few years ago, you had me in your sights and you got me alone. And then all of a sudden, like, they'll pause. And someone will go, Taylor Swift? And I'm like, yes. And then I'll go on. And I'll have stacks of music lyrics. And I'll do a bunch of them. By now, you know your students. You probably know some of them that have like heavy metal T-shirts. And so I'll have set up in advance, copied and pasted some music lyrics of popular songs, modern ones, songs from the past too. I'll be like 24 hours ago, and I want to be sedated. And someone will be like, Ramones? Like there'll be, students that know these lyrics. And so I'll end up doing maybe 10 to 12 or 15 of those songs. But I'll speak them. I won't sing them. I'll speak it like it's normal poetry lyrics, what you would say, right? And you start to, and like I said, you got to use popular ones, not really old ones, right? Even though some of my examples there might have been outdated. And then if you know someone that always wears a Green Day shirt, like put a Green Day song in there. And so you don't need to just say the first stanza until someone shouts out who it is. And then by then tell them, like, after you're done, 10 or 15 or 20 songs. Like I said, I have a stack of music lyrics I would use. Then I would say, okay, obviously after a while you figured out that those were song lyrics. How many of you love music, love songs? And then all hands will go up. And I would say, but wait, before we started this exercise, most of you said you hated poetry. But now you say you love songs. And what I'll do is I'll tell the students, like I'll say music, but when I say music, I mean songs. I don't mean like, instrumental music. So I'll say music. I'll probably say it throughout this video. Just know that I mean songs, lyrics. And I'll say, what's the issue is, students have never been taught, I'll explain my students this, that music, song lyrics, are the most popular form of poetry. There's not even a close second. And I'll explain how usually what people don't like of poetry is whatever's kind of crammed down their throat through the textbook, right? There's just certain types of poems, and they're only looking for certain things. And I'll talk to them about that, and I'll say, what we don't realize as lovers of poetry is that music, song lyrics is poetry. It's our most popular form of poetry. And then that's how I mentioned before. That's when I go back to the definition of a poem. So I'll still be like, some of you don't believe me. So let's look at this. Now look at the definition of a poem. A poem, a verbal composition, right? A song, characterized by its use of condensed language. So in a song, you have about 1.5 minutes worth of lyrics because the chorus is repeated multiple times. And so a songwriter has to tell an entire story using very few words, condensed language. And the words that are used are chosen for its sound and suggestive power. So music, songs, the most popular form of poetry, and I feel it should be taught more in schools. And so I share the students that. And they start realizing like, oh my gosh. So I'm like, yeah, next time you listen to a song with your parents or whatever, be like, dude, that poem is amazing. But then I also mentioned the second most popular form of poetry, I said, is yelling, is cussing at someone. And they're like, what? And I'm like, okay, let's look at the definition of a poem. A verbal composition, right? Someone yelling at someone else. Characterized by the use of condensed language, right? They're not like, let me tell you why I don't like you, blah, 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 blah. No, it's condensed language, right? Very few words chosen for its sound and suggestive power. Like sometimes those words are intended to harm. Well, oftentimes that they're yelling. And so next time you guys see people yelling at each other and cussing each other out, just kick back, grab some popcorn, and just watch the poetry, right? Just watch it. And again, it gets students to chuckle, but it gets them to kind of see how poetry is not just the stuff that's in the textbook. Actually, the stuff that's in the textbook is a very small amount of poetry. And so let me go back to the lesson. And so that's why that the next part here on the next handout, these are just my notes, but as if you're intending to teach this, you can adjust however you want, right? I'm a big believer in you as the teacher should teach to your strength, teach to your personality. Don't teach to my personality, right? That would be insincere, right? Unless you're like, no, I want to model what you're doing. That's cool, but teach it in your way, right? So I'll tell the students, I'll say, so here's what I think as a teacher and someone who grew up in a poetry household, right? My life poetry. I'll say, I think that poetry is taught incompletely in school. And I'll be honest with my students. And then I'll explain this. I'll say, so we understand and analyze the theme of a poem holistically. That's accurate. If we're listening to a song, and going back to the idea that songs and music are the most popular form of poetry, by far, there's not even a close second, then when we listen to a song, we understand the song holistically. We understand the poem holistically. And we can interpret metaphors instantly in our head. So Bruno Mars, I always use the example Bruno Mars, Catch a Grenade for You. He's not like a catch a grenade for you. Like, really? No, that's a metaphor. Like it's something that when you listen to that song, you don't go, oh my gosh, I fear for him, right? For his safety. Like, no, you understand it holistically. So I said that's why sometimes we're asking students to analyze individual lines, which is not how we tend to understand poetry, because we understand it holistically, right? And so I mentioned, like, it's difficult for people to take a random line and accurately interpret it without theme, context, and what I think is the most important part, what is going on with the author and society at that time. And I'm going to get to that later, because I bring that up a lot when it comes to poetry. And again, when I mention poetry, I'm including music. I want to make sure that's clear. Not only including it, like, it is kind of the focal point of this. And I'll mention, like, if we, to really understand a poem, we have to trust that the author is, we have to trust the intention of what the author is writing, and we have to trust that the author is accurate, that it's accurate, right? Because, like, there's an emotional bias going on, right? We have to understand what's going on in the author's background. We have to understand what's going on in the author's life. We have to understand, like, what the purpose of the writing of the poem was. Some people just write stuff for money. I'm going to get that a little bit later on. So that's why I explain, like, why poetry tends to be taught incompletely. There's so many other aspects rather than let's look at the words and interpret the words line by line, without kind of taking all the other factors into account. And I mentioned this. I say, look, poetry is really what you feel. It's an expression of emotions, unless you're getting paid to write the poem, right? And so I mentioned this, like, this isn't like, I say, it's whatever you're feeling, just put it out there, right? That's poetry. And I use this example of Ariana Grande, Thank You Next. And I pulled this random line. There's a line in the song that she goes, I'm so amazing. And I asked the students, is that what's the song about? And people are like, oh, it's about how she, like, dated people and, like, learned from it and kind of moved on with her life. Like, they taught her what she needed and she moved on. I'm like, yeah, but if you look at the line, I'm so amazing, it suggests that the poem is about her being conceited. And they're like, no, that's not what it's about. I'm like, exactly. So if you're pulling random lines out without knowing the history of the author, knowing the context in which it was written, knowing, all those things, it's going to be very difficult to be able to accurately interpret that poem. Then I'll take it another step further and I'll say, okay, let me ask you guys, what are you feeling right now? Literally right now. If you're hungry, just say you're hungry, right? But take a minute and a half to write about it. Now have them take a minute and a half to write down whatever they're feeling. Free write. They don't have to share if they don't want to, but just literally just what are they feeling? Because now they're essentially writing a poem, right? So that's the next exercise. Then after that, then what I do is I say, all right, let's look at some similes and metaphors. Let's kind of take a sidestep a little bit, and let's talk about similes and metaphors. And because this first day is about similes, and so I'll show this video, and I'll show, like, the song goes on. But I'll show the different, similes and metaphors in music. So I show that video. It just goes a couple minutes, right? Then we end class, and it sounds like this whole thing just takes one day, I promise you, by doing the 3 simile lines exercise. And so what I'll do is I'll show examples first. I'm a big believer. I think if teachers don't show enough examples to students, it confuses students. And I think sometimes as teachers, we feel that our students would already know. They know what similes are. Okay, you're right. But let's just show a bunch of examples, right? Just to get them primed, right? And so here's my list of examples of similes. And I'll just show you, I'll go over each one, right? Go over a bunch of them. And then I ask them to write 3 simile lines. Like literally just make up 3 similes. I say take 3 minutes. That's all you need. 3 minutes, 2 minutes maybe. Don't spend too much time. Keep the students moving. And 3 similes, make them up. I said don't Google them, just make them up. Don't use one you've heard before. Totally make it up. That's the first step. So that takes 3 minutes. Step number 2, choose one of them. And I'll be like, just the one, whatever. I hate to use like choose your best one because who's going to say what the best is? Like who are we to say, right? Just choose one you want to work with. That's what I'll say. And then I'll say, take that simile and either explain it or expand on it with 3 more lines. That creates a lyrical stanza. So here's my example. I bolded the simile and I show this. I said, here's what I'm talking about. So the simile is, you're beautiful, like a dream come alive, incredible, a sinful miracle, lyrical. And I believe that's Selena Gomez. And I'll say, so she put the simile in the middle. And then she set up the simile. Every beautiful thought's already been sung, etc., etc. She gave her simile and then she ended it, right, with like a final concluding sentence. So I tell the students you can put the simile in the middle. You can put the simile at the beginning. Do you ever feel like a plastic bag? And then explain it. Well, what do you mean? Well, drifting through the wind, wanting to start again, etc., Katy Perry. Or you can kind of put it like towards the end. Your beauty's something that can't be replaced. I don't know where to begin. Your eyes are like pools of holy water. When I look at them, I want to dive in. So usually there's like 5 minutes left in class, and I'll say, okay, take the remaining 3 minutes and just and complete, just write a lyrical stanza. Add a few sentences before, afterward, or you start at the beginning and then explain it or expand on it, and that finishes with 3 minutes. If you have a couple minutes left, then you can ask for examples. So just a real quick review. I start class by having the students write down the definitions of poetry. We're going to go back to those definitions throughout this unit. I ask students how many are not real big fans of poetry. I usually get a bunch of responses. I tell them that not only are they fans of it, but they absolutely love it. And I said, now I got to prove it to you. I do the music lyric exercise where I start with some basics, what you'd call standard poems. So I'm kind of tricking them with what they're doing. Then I start hitting them with the music lyrics. And then I explain why I feel like poetry is taught incompletely, so the students don't think it's their fault, right? Then I show them, I kind of say, okay, now we're going to transition to similes. I show them a real quick video that has maybe 5 or 6 songs that are just similes. And then I do the 3 simile lines exercise. That ends day 1. So hopefully that made sense. Again, you can take the lesson, write it however you'd like, adjust it however you'd like. Contact me if you want some more information about it, etc. Thanks for watching.